dry academic introductions of I don't know what this person does. We actually work together and like each other. So my thanks always to Kendra and also to our business specialist who's hiding behind Kendra. That's Angela. So strong women, yes. That's why I started doing Irish female pirates. You stay on the deck and fight while the men go down in the hatch and get drunk. Well, that's another lecture, so I won't get into that now. Let's start on the subject of vampires. And if I click this magic thing, will it go on? Can I?
One sec.
1 second? Well, that's fine, because alright, while we're waiting for this to warm up, let me already start, because God knows I can talk. If we talk about the idea of vampirism in world literature, what we're going to focus on right now are vampire legends from the years 500 AD or ACE to about the end of the 17th century. I'm going to start, let's go back. I'm going to start not in Transylvania, although I promise we will get to Transylvania. And somebody else's name should be on this because it was my dear Kendra who created this PowerPoint. She will be carted off by the police at the end of the evening because this is a pretty demented PowerPoint. I will claim nothing to do with this. Where she got the content. But I noticed the way Kendra took her name off here, so if the police show up, you wouldn't think of me away. So we were going to go from ancient Peru to Transylvania, although the title we have it as Transylvania to ancient Peru. Why am I starting in Peru? There's a very bizarre connection that you may or may not be aware of the Dracula legend with Peru. And since the Dracula legend for people here in North America is probably the most well-known vampire legend, we want to lure you in. Isn't that what vampires do? So there is that connection with one of Dracula's 6 wives. I'm going to leave you in suspense because we will get to it. But it also turns out that one of the reasons there is such interest in the vampire legends in Peru of Dracula's 6 wives is that Peru has its own indigenous vampire tradition going back over 1,000 years, going back literally to the mid-5th century. And there's a very, very great civilization called the Moche who had their own tradition of vampire lore. So we're going to go from Peru to Transylvania and back to Peru. And in the meantime, I may also mention vampires in other places. Okay? Feel free to mention any other vampire in any other place that you want. And one thing I do want you to see as we go through the talk is that beyond the horror, I don't think there's anything we could see on screen that would terrify us. So I will tell you that it's a very pretty PowerPoint. I'm not going for gore. And when Kendra was choosing the images for my very weird lecture, we were not going for gore. Gore doesn't frighten you. You've seen everything you can possibly see at this point. What's interesting here are the psychological meanings of vampirism. What we're going to look at is really the connection between the idea of vampirism and rulership, and also sex. Maybe like ending with that word. As a child, they taught me, you know, when you study Introduction to Communications in Argentina, just make a blank poster and write the word sex in tiny letters in the middle of the poster, and everybody will walk up to the poster. And that has a lot to do with the lore of the vampire legends, because as I'm sure you're aware, they are extremely sexual legends. And there's no way that you could compare the story of Dracula to other well-known horror stories of the West, such as Frankenstein. Because there's little that's sensual in Frankenstein. You're going to see there's everything that's sensual about these vampires, including in the oldest vampire lore, which is from ancient Peru. So now let's from Peru to Romania, vampire genesis. Now, who are you looking at here? So, 1,500 years ago, the rulers of Peru were not. Who do you know in Peru? Give me a name. Who ruled ancient Peru? What was the great Indian civilization in Peru? The Incas. Thank you. Very good. You now have 10 points. You will not be decapitated by Ai Aipec, the decapitator. The rest of you, I don't know. 1,500 years ago, the great ruling medieval civilization of ancient Peru were not the Incas. The Incas just sprung up in the 12th century. You know them because they were there when the Spanish invaded. But they were far from the first. They're actually the last indigenous civilization of that time. If you had gone to Peru in the early Middle Ages, okay, if you got tired of the Merovingians and the Carolingians and you wanted to jump ship, you would have met the Moche. So Moche civilization ran roughly up to the time that Charlemagne was crowned in Europe. Okay, so you can center yourself there with a mutual timeline. We're in the north of Peru, in the desert areas, where water is very important and where water and blood are considered to be part of the same life essence. And the person or the being you are looking at is Ai Aipec, the decapitator god and the masculine avatar of the owl goddess. Now, who is this person? Because he shows up throughout all of Moche art, and this was a great civilization that lasted for nearly 1,000 years. That's a long time, people. The United States is how old? 200 some odd years? Will we make it to 1,000? I don't know. That's already a very long timeline for a civilization, and this is the primary god. Please notice the fangs. You know, when archaeologists started to dig this up in Peru in the early 1980s, the local indigenous people told the archaeologists, you know, these stories are stories. We do not believe that there was really somebody by the name of Ai Aipec who flew around. Ai Aipec for us represents the masculine life force. And so it is a very sexualized image because Ai Aipec, and if anybody's afraid of sex, people walk out now. Because sex is going to come into this on every slide. It is part of the legend. Ai Aipec, the creator deity, infuses life with blood and semen. And also demands blood, but did he demand that blood literally? If you look at Moche art, you're going to see a lot of these fanged images and captives spouting blood from the neck, but is this really happening? Is Picasso's art really happening for the Moche Indians? This is symbolic. Throughout most of their civilization it was. The idea that you would do self-mutilation, not to the point of death, to give some blood to the creator god. The creator god had created you, and there's a slightly vampirical agreement between the two of you, so you give some blood back to him. The owl goddess will always be the symbol of the god who sucks and gives blood. Now, you're aware in Western horror stories, every time you hear a hoo-hoo in the tree, the owl always signifies something dreadful. But in Native American civilization, that's not true. We're going to see later on, the owl actually saves you from evil death. And there is what you call a good death and an evil death. So not all death is evil. That's also something you have to keep in mind as we go through this folklore. So you can look at that and say, or you can look at that and say, well, what is this saying to me? What is this saying about sexuality? Very strong masculine sexuality in this civilization. Warriors had to show that they bled to show their prowess. And so the ultimate symbol of military prowess was Ai Aipec, whose name literally means, in the Mochica language, the decapitator god. Well, that sounds like, ooh, he's nasty. Cutting off your head. But in the tradition of the native peoples of the Americas, to be reborn spiritually, you have to literally dismember yourself spiritually. So a lot of times when we talk about dismemberment, you have to think about it spiritually. You kind of have to die a complete death in terms of your current personality to really be reborn. Okay, Native American shaman have been doing this for thousands of years before Western gurus started selling you these packages for weekends, you know, be reborn on the weekend. But what you would have to give here was not money, but some blood. Not to the point of death, but some blood. But did this later become corrupted as the civilization became more militarized, as the Moche became more like a group you may know because they're closer to you, and in fact they came originally from this area, the Aztecs of Mexico. The Aztecs, like the Spanish, like the English, had a military civilization. The Moche, as they started to expand, though they were never an empire, the empire in Peru would be the Incas, began to take these symbolic ideas and turn them into symbols of military terror. This happens in every civilization, including all of Western civilization. You're going to see the same processes everywhere. So the Moche, the more the cult of the decapitator god became associated with military power, the more the symbolism began to die out, and the blood offerings now became real offerings to the dead. But notice the child is actually from a Japanese manga. Notice the Japanese manga are incredible. They intercalate a lot of symbols from Native American, obviously Asian, but cultures everywhere. The mask of Ai Aipec, the decapitator god, would be worn into battle. There would be small pitched battles between the supreme warriors. This was not mass warfare on a Western scale. And it was an honor to die. Now that might strike you as a little odd, but compare it to the Japanese cult of the samurai. Alright, this was an honorable death. You can compare it to motifs as well that exist in early Norse literature. You'll find this. Compare it to certain things I know from the Old Testament, alright, when King Saul falls on his sword. That is considered an honorable death. So you will choose an honorable death, and you will go to meet Ai Aipec. So we don't have a system where evil sacrifices are coming into the population, saying, "Ooh, I think this nice person who sometimes pretends he's Cardinal Wolsey." Have you ever seen him dressed up as Cardinal Wolsey? I think I'll sacrifice Cardinal Wolsey. I'm sick of Cardinal Wolsey. Yeah, especially Charles V in Spain. No, I'm not going to go out looking for people to sacrifice. Au contraire, you're going to compete with somebody to see which one of you can be sacrificed. So is there an element of horror in it? I think there's more of an element of horror in terms of how these cultural elements are interpreted later. All right? This was an honorable death. You could choose it. But guess what? The other native peoples weren't so fond of the Moche because the Moche were frightening. So they started to see the Moche as vampires. And you start to see in the folklore of Peru, and this continues up to the point that the conquistadors invade Peru, and it continues now. There are going to be three civilizations the other native peoples always connect with: vampires. Blood-sucking vampires, and you're going to see in a minute, fat-sucking vampires. And those three, yeah, I know what you're saying. No liposuction. Let me just... Ai Aipec, where are you? No, because when Ai Aipec gets you, he doesn't just say, "I'll take 2 inches off." So, the three civilizations that are vampiricized in Peruvian tradition are the Moche, because they could kind of screw your day up if they showed up in your neighborhood. The Inca, who had the same imperial philosophy as, guess who follows them? The Spanish conquistadors. And they were all portrayed in a vampirical light. And I'm telling you this again so you understand suddenly why this story of Dracula's sixth wife being in Peru will spring up in the 20th century. We have a long time to get to that. So the other native peoples, the Yaoyo, the Yunka, all these names that you might not remember, but that I remember because I worked with them for many years, started to call them Kharisiri, which means liquid sucker. Now, according to the tradition, in the Andes, you could be killed by a Kharisiri. What does a Kharisiri look like? Long fangs, pale skin. Here comes something weird. Blue eyes. You know now this tradition is post-Spanish conquest because they want to blue eyes earlier. But they would first go for your fat. Now, hold on. No, hold on. Because these are cultural values. In our culture, ooh, fat is terrible, fat is dreadful. Go back into history, okay? Wonderful Italian painter of the Renaissance, Titian, loved really healthy women. I am also fairly healthy, I don't have a problem with it. Having some meat on your bones was considered a sign of wealth and beauty. Looking like a cadaver was not. So I know everybody's going, right on, native peoples, right on Tyson. Let me get to the art museum and see it. Seriously. These are cultural values. The idea of extreme thinness being popular is only post-Twiggy. Okay, that, came in fairly recently. Go back and look at the goddesses of screen culture in the 1950s. Jane Russell, she had enough on top and enough on the bottom. Marilyn Monroe. So the idea of fat was that it could be rich and decadent and beautiful, and they would suck it all out of you and leave you like a cadaver. It's very frightening, this idea that the Kharisiri would turn up and literally suck you dry. And more than anything, it is a memory of the very harsh domination of both the Spanish crown and the Incas. Okay? For most of the native peoples of Peru, that was same you-know-what, different day. Okay? So the vampire legend now we see becomes very politicized, and it's going to stay political from this point on. Now, this is what you see in Peru when you've had a little too much chichajora to drink. And some of you may remember a lovely movie from the late 1960s, which was shown throughout really the 80s. What movie? Dr. Dolittle. Thank you. Let's all date ourselves. Dr. Dolittle, there's this wonderful character called the Push Me Pull You, which, was inspired by Walt Disney he traveled to South Argentina, where we also have llamas. And that's where the settings for Bambi came from. Do you know that? That's Bariloche in the Argentine mountains, the Argentine part of the Andes. And he saw llamas standing. Llamas have this weird habit. They actually do it to avoid jaguars attacking them. When one llama eats, the other llama turns the other side to see if a jaguar is coming from the back. And that became the push me pull you that you saw. But this idea of the push me pull you, Walt Disney also got from the native peoples of Peru, because the carcancha, as it's called, this monstrous sin, comes about when you've done something sexually illicit, and then it shows up in your pueblo to tell everybody what you've done. Because the two-headed llama will go and stand in front of your door and say, ha ha ha, you did it. And yes, your neighbors do notice when you have a two-headed llama in front of your door. They tend to notice that. And the carcancha shows up for 3 sins. First one's adultery, so you can imagine everybody in Peru says, I know why that thing's in front of your house. Or theft, or blood or fat sucking. So if you're going vampire on your neighbors and not telling them, a two-headed llama will show up. And so this idea of monstrous, because people, when we say the term monstrous, okay, let's think what that term meant. Let's go back to the early 16th century. What did that term really mean? In early English literature, in early Spanish literature, we say monster now, we kind of think of dumb Hollywood images, correct? But monstrous just meant something that went outside of nature. Okay, and it's really not going to be till the 18th century in both the Spanish and English languages that the term monster will be, ooh, evil, scary monster. Anything could be monstrous if it was outside of nature, but it could also be beautiful. So the great German writer Goethe, this is already after the 18th century, in the 19th century, calls the Alps of Europe monstrous. And you read that now, and if you don't understand that the word did not quite mean, even in Goethe's time, in the early 19th century, what it means now, monstrous was not always an insult. It doesn't mean you should go to your best friend and say, hey, you look monstrous today, because it has changed. But monstrous just means anything outside of nature. Curiously enough, in Quechua, which is, of course, the dominant language of native Peru, still a language spoken by 12 million people. Don't think that language has died out. Peru is multilingual, Spanish, Quechua, and 12 other Indian languages. And Quechua is one of the 3 official languages of Bolivia and Ecuador. So a lot of people speak this language. It's also spoken in Argentina. The carcancha, what exactly is that connected with another word in Quechua which means huaca. Huaca means monstrous, holy, and beautiful. The word is still applied to all three meanings today. And that's interesting because that brings us back to what Shakespeare meant when he said monstrous. Okay, if you don't believe me, go back and start checking in Shakespeare's comedies. In The Tempest, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, in Twelfth Night, he often calls things monstrous wonderful. Okay? So, he shows up at your doorstep. Your neighbors know you were cheating on somebody, or you were sucking somebody's blood. And if the village doesn't take action against you, then the hoogie shows up. And now you're in trouble when the hoogie shows up. So, what in God's name is a hoogie? Let's talk about it. So you're fine with the carcancha, right? When it shows up on your doorstep? Where is the hoogie? Oh, you're looking at some gorgeous images of the Andes Mountains. So the hoogie is the one creature most feared by Andean peoples. And this is something terrifying. And you know the thing about the hoogie? If you translate hoogie from the Yaoyo language, what it means is imagination. Because there is nothing as horrific as what you imagine. Your own fears are far worse than Frankenstein, Dracula, and the mummy all combined. You make your own hell, right? Shakespeare also said that, right? Man's mind can make it a hell of heaven or a heaven of hell. So, where is the hoogie? They'll laugh if you ask them this question in the Andes, wherever you least want it. Because it's your fears. There's a wonderful story about the hoogie in a very supernatural manuscript we have from the Yaoyo Indians in Peru called the Legends of Huarachiwi, Legends of the Gods of Huarachiwi. And in this manuscript, the chief god, the mountain god, the water god, called Pariacasa, can get every monster except for this freaking hoogie. He cannot get the hoogie. The hoogie defeats him. And to get the hoogie, he has to sit down with human beings. He's a god, but he has to sit down with human beings and tell them about his problems with the hoogie. Does it sound a bit like what you call psychoanalysis? And it's only after Pariacasa goes through this really annoying period of sitting down and consulting when they all get the hoogie. So when you talk to Native American shaman in Peru, they will tell you the only way to deal with the hoogie, this is your fears, is by speaking to someone. Okay, we call that therapy. So this idea of the monstrous also has a psychological connotation. But then there are things which are going to start resembling more the vampire you know her from Western lore. Although with the Mayan Indians, because the Mayans are very rebellious people, and that's why they still exist, by the way, 6 million Maya. They have not disappeared, despite what you hear on every National Geographic documentary. No, they have not. They're here, they yell, they scream, they curse, you know. You can talk on cell phones in Maya. There are 6 million Mayan people, right? Divided between Yucatan, Guatemala, some in El Salvador, a lot in Honduras, and Belize. They are still here, if not gone anywhere. And their holy book is called the Popol Vuh. And the Popol Vuh is basically a wonderful manual for how to punch gods in the face. Because their worldview is very different I think, from any other worldview that I have encountered as an anthropologist. The Mayans do not believe you should submit to holy powers. They believe you should fight them. They believe the gods are often really stupid. You know, it's a much more livable philosophy. Let me tell you, it's a much healthier philosophy. You know? So when the gods give you a stupid order, do you shut your eyes and say that is the will of God, God's ways are inscrutable, or do you say no? They say no. So let's look at this, because this is intimately connected to a very, very clear vampire legend we find in the Popol Vuh, which means the Book of Counsel. And this book, by the way, for anybody, you know the Mayans had a written language, by the way. The huge exception to that myth that no native people had a written language. Most of their documents were burned by the Bishop Diego de Landa during the Spanish conquest. 3,000 Mayan codices were burned. But the Mayans, thank God, wrote everywhere else. On their buildings, they wrote other codexes. And after the conquest, the Mayans sat down and rewrote their stories. They rewrote them secretly in the 16th century, and in the 18th century, a Spanish priest, Padre Jimenez, who was pretty disgusted at what Spain had done, actually translated this work into Spanish. So what are you looking at there? Her name is Ixquic, and she is the princess of the underworld. She's the daughter of the vampire god. Why am I calling him the vampire god? Because in Mayan his name is Vucub Caquish, which means literally, he who sucks blood and pus. You do not want him in parties. He's not nice. But Ixquic is not like her father. This is not like father, like daughter. No way. And Ixquic does not like the fact that her father's favorite pastime is to go up to the middle world. Ooh, that exists long before Tolkien. Sorry. God bless Tolkien, though he did not invent that idea. He actually stole that from Norse mythology, right? But that's also in the mythologies of many, many peoples. So, her father's favorite pastime is to go up to the middle world, play the sacred ball game with the ball players. You know, for the Mayans, they have a sacred ball game, which is maybe the origin of our South American passion for soccer, but the ball game represented Venus and the sun going through the heavens, okay? And it was played a bit like soccer, except the only thing you could touch the hard rubber ball with was your hip or your knee. It was played with a stone yoke around your waist to show how macho you were. And so her father would play the game with whomever he brought down to Xibalba, the Mayan underworld. In 1 second we're going to talk about what the Mayan underworld means, because it's very different from hell. And then he would sacrifice them and hang their heads on a tree. But that's a particular tree, that's the chocolate tree. Cacao was first cultivated by the Mayan peoples. Every time you have chocolate, you say thank you, Mayan civilization. Yeah, because apart from writing and astronomy and everything else, they gave us chocolate. And so, chocolate grows on a tree, for those who think it grows in bars. It grows on a tree. And in Latin America, we have chocolate forests. Okay? And the chocolate seed, when it is full grown, if you've never seen it, happens to look like a human skull. So Ixquic is walking through Xibalba, through the underworld, and she sees these skulls hanging on a tree, and one of the skulls calls to her and says, Ixquic, by the way, her name in Mayan means Lady Blood Moon. And so Lady Blood Moon, I think you want to get close to me. And Ixquic says, well, I think I do. And he says, I think you want to get closer. Maybe you want something I have. She says, what do you have? And he says, I have my spittle. Doesn't that sound romantic? Well, it's a metaphor for something else that comes squirting out. I don't have to. And so Ixquic puts her hand out and he says, are you sure you want it? And when you read this, if you read it either in Spanish or in Quiche Mayan or in a wonderful English translation that I'll quote to you later by Dennis Hedlock, it's very sexual. Are you sure you want it? Oh, I'm sure I want it. And he spits, and there's the beautiful glittering spittle going into her hand, and as you can imagine, 9 months later she's pregnant. And her father, the vampire god of Xibalba, says to his friends, we have to sacrifice her and drink her blood. She got pregnant out of wedlock. Now next to the Mayan image, this is an image of a modern day Mayan artist. We have another image of Aztec sacrifice. And you know, the Mayans were very much in contact with the Aztecs, whom they did not like. And the Mayans were not particularly submissive, and they didn't like the idea about giving their blood to the sun god, which is what the Aztecs did with their warriors. So the Popol Vuh gives us a different message. When Ixquic is told, we need your blood for the sacrifice, we want to drink your blood, she doesn't say, oh yes, father. She goes off to her friends, a particular bird. Which bird do you think it will be? Not a sparrow, because that would be like silly and not very dramatic. Raven, possibly. That's a good possibility. Not quite Cardinal Wolsey, but you're close. Owls. Goes to the owls. And the owls say, look, Ixquic, querida, we want to help you. But this is kind of screwed, because your father is our boss. So she says, let's make a deal. Okay? I'll make you a deal you can't refuse. If we can get something that looks like my heart, that has what appears to be human blood, and we cook that up, and you give that to my father, blood and pus sucker, and he thinks that's my heart, you take me up to the middle world, and I'll free you, and you will never have to work for Xibalba again. I'm sure all of us have at least once in our life had the experience of working for a boss from Xibalba. At least once. If you're over the age of 30, you've had that experience. So they want out. So what do? They go to a tree which grows all over Central America. In Spanish we call it sangre de dragón, dragon blood, because the sap that comes out is very thick and has a consistency of human blood. And the owls say to Ixquic, all right, let us do this thing. And they fashion a fake heart. Now you know what this story is also showing you? It's showing you the Mayan rejection of Aztec heart sacrifice. It's also showing you a very gutsy woman. It's showing you a different conception of a female than those women who are bitten by Dracula. Hell no. No, she's not going this way. So the owls make a fake heart. And they give it to her father, the vampire god of Xibalba. And, oh, he gloats about it. Yes, that's it. You sacrificed my daughter. Right on. Let me drink her blood. And Ixquic, of course, is listening on the side. And as soon as her father finishes drinking what he thinks is her blood, the owls say, come on, we'll take you up. And the owls take her up to the middle world. She becomes the mother of humanity. So she said, to the vampire. And escapes Xibalba. But you can all escape Xibalba, because here's the difference with the concept of hell. What does Xibalba mean in Quiche Mayan? Place of fear. Actually, that's not it. It means place of your fear. It has the possessive for your. This is what you imagine. Can you go to Xibalba? You can go to Xibalba and come up from Xibalba. In the Mayan stories, the heroes and heroines are always going up and down, because you go in and out of your own fears. You have to confront your fears and then come up. So it's a different concept of hell. Well, could you stay in Xibalba forever? Yeah, the Mayans will tell you, if you never confront your fears, you will be in Xibalba forever. The only way to free yourself from your own personal hell is to face it. So it is not a permanent decree. The idea of the vampire god as a reality is a little clearer among the mythologies of those who again fought the Incas. Because this issue of the Incas being seen, first the Incas, then the Spanish conquistadors, as vampires who would just abuse you and suck you dry, comes from one very clear fact. Both the Incas and the Spaniards would force you to work where? What made Spain rich? What made the Incas rich? Gold, silver. What countries had the largest supply of gold and silver? Peru and Bolivia. Right? That's how the credit system comes into Europe. That's what changes the European economy. So, yeah, Latin America's there, and a lot of native peoples were dying during that point. So this image, Piuchen, the flying vampire rat. Isn't that something you don't want to see after a hangover? Piuchen, that does look like something you would see after a hangover, yeah? Piuchen comes to us from the Mapuche people. The Mapuche are among the only native peoples who fought successfully every empire that tried to do them in. They have never been conquered. Mayans were conquered, but they fought back. The Mapuche were never conquered, and the only other people like this are in the United States, and they live in Florida. They are the Seminole Indians. These two groups were never conquered. And the Mapuche have this image of Piuchen, the flying vampire rat, who can only be killed by a woman. Now look at something very interesting here. We have Ishkik. You can do... Oh, take that off. If you want to sit down. Yeah, that's my stuff. Feel free. We have Ishkik, who basically tricks her father, the vampire god, in Xibalba. She's a woman. And this thing can only be killed by a woman. So men, if you find this alone, you're screwed. And by the way, in Mapuche tradition, the holy man is a woman. It's only a woman. It's called the machi. The priest is only a priestess. There are no male priests. So the idea is that the woman has a very great sacred power. And she's the only one who can kill Piuchen because the woman is the only one who gives her blood as a sacrifice monkey. So what are we talking about? Restoration. How do you kill this when you see it? You better know in case you walk out. You need a burning blanket. Quick, go to Bed Bath & Beyond. You need a burn, but there's a reason, there's a method to this madness. You have to throw the burning blanket on the nest of the Piuchen. The Piuchen is born in a tree and hangs upside down. It's half bat, half rat, half snake, and all yuck. What is the importance of killing it in its nest? You have to root out evil where evil is born. Okay, so this is the idea that you have to root out evil at its root. What is the cause of evil? Now, Piuchen has metamorphosed in 20th, 21st century Latin American folklore and reappeared on the island of Puerto Rico as chupacabras, a goat sucker. How he flew from Chile and Peru, I don't know, but he ended up in San Juan, my dear. Have you ever run into him on a really dark and stormy night? Obviously, you don't hang out with the right crowd. Wonderful friend of ours. So, well, he's called Chupacabras, the bloodsucker of the goats. And if you ever get tired of looking at English language nonsense reports on UFOs, well, look at Spanish language reports on the goat vampire bloodsucker. They're equally ridiculous. And by the way, on the island of Puerto Rico, this has become, I love Puerto Rico, don't take this the wrong way. This has become fused with the idea of extraterrestrials. The reason is that one of the greatest astronomical observatories is in Puerto Rico. So as a result, because you have some of the greatest scientific research going on the island, you also have a bunch of crazies who are always saying, oh look, I see flying saucers. And who's getting out of the flying saucers? Chupacabras! And because, according to the Mapuche legend, Piuchen flies extraterrestrial. And so, of course, who is going to pick up on this? The crazy hair man on the Discovery Channel with the fake Greek accent who says, oh, you know, this is extraterrestrial. So he went to San Juan and said, and people have seen Piuchen after 5 glasses of rum. Piuchen. So the vampire legend becomes extended to the idea of sucking blood from goats. People, why would this be important? For if you live in an agricultural society, As one wonderful Puerto Rican farmer explained it to me, I'm really not going to care so much if they suck the blood of my family. My goats, that's another thing. That's your livelihood. That is your livelihood. So we see how the vampire legend becomes very, very connected with politics, with sex, but also with economy. Okay, this is an amazingly flexible legend. By the way, before I forget, it's really ugly. Before I forget, we mentioned the owls and the Popol Vuh. And just so you can see, people, how these stories travel, the oldest vampire legend that I have been able to locate in anthropology comes from a book written in 1905 called The Golden Bough. If you have never heard of that book, please get it and read it, because although sadly enough, I think it's out of print, there are a number of copies of it on Amazon. Boys and men, if you want to buy some copies of it, that might be something wonderful to do. Written by one of the earliest anthropologists of the 20th century, James Fraser. And he literally traveled through Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Latin America, and East Africa, collecting stories. There is a story from Central Asia which has its earliest written source, so it may be contemporary with the Moche legends of Peru, going back to the 3rd century, written in Chinese characters from an area actually above China and above Mongolia. It's Central Asia. Nowadays it would be called Kazakhstan. And it's the tale of Bakalu, the lake of Bakalu, which is a huge lake in Central Asia, where there are stories of owls who save people who would be killed by the blood-sucking wind demons. Now, when I read that, I thought, wow. Because if you know the background of many of the native civilizations of the Americas, not all, but much of native culture also begins when you have great migrations across the Bering Strait coming from Central Asia. And say the DNA of our Navajo peoples and of our Hopi peoples. They're doing a lot of research on this, and the Navajo and Hopi reservations are almost identical to tribes that live in Central Asia. So did this idea of owls as saviors come about? Owls saving you from vampires? It's interesting because in Western stories, that doesn't exist. The owl in the Dracula legend plays no such nice role. And by the way, just in case you're not a woman, you don't have a burning blanket, and you encounter him, you better have an owl with you, because that's the only bird that can kill the blood-sucking Piuchen. What is this based on? Well, Mapuche people observed owls. They eat rats. Okay, so men, either get a woman, a burning blanket, or an owl. You're going to get your blood sucked, but we have to. So we see that the vampire legends are widespread. And you know what? If I was more of an expert in the stories of Africa and India, I would mention those stories to you too. As an anthropologist, I focus more on Latin America, Celtic culture, biblical culture. But I will tell you, there's a tremendous amount of vampire lore also from India, also from East Africa. So this idea of a bloodsucker is very humanly widespread. But ain't no vampire as famous in the Western world as Ai Aipec is in the Latin American world as Dracula. So of course, you already know that's Dracula. And you may have seen this image. This image of Dracula was not an image painted of Dracula, because this image of Dracula comes from the late 1570s, which is about a century after he died. What's interesting about this image, because it is an imagined image, is its connection with what were known as certain ornaments or symbols that Vlad wore constantly. Now, if you want the first historical record of Dracula written down, before we get into all the crazy folklore and Dracula becomes he who flies through the night and attacks women at night, always women. That's much later. The first written account is 1490. Does anybody want to guess what language it's written in? It's not Romanian and it's not Hungarian.
German. Latin.
Good, everybody's wrong. Think Slavic.
Russian.
Yes. In 1490, the first written account of the history of Vlad comes out of Russia. Now that's awfully interesting because Russia was not directly affected by his actions, but it's fascinating because it shows us how his fame had spread. And even though we don't really have the sexual element of Dracula in there, we do have the vampirical element. Okay, let's take a look at the images. What image jumps out to you? Because this is a beautiful example, well, beautiful, the one in my living room, but this is an interesting example of Renaissance portraiture, even though, again, the person who painted the portrait never knew Vlad the Impaler, because it was painted 100 years after he died. But what symbols seem to be jutting out at you?
Star.
Okay, so first let's look at the star with the ruby. The star symbolizes one particular planet, which was associated very much with Dracula, the little dragon, as his nickname was. What planet might that be?
Venus.
Say it louder.
Venus.
Thank you, Venus. Now, why Venus? Why does Venus have this kind of, shall I say, treasured place in the occult at this point in Eastern Europe? People in Eastern Europe noticed exactly what the native civilizations of the New World noticed about Venus. Venus was a bit weird because Venus disappeared and reappeared. And reappeared and disappeared. You know the cycles of Venus, 236 days, then disappears for 8, 250 days, then disappears for 36 days, for 90 days. Why do I know this? This is a very big part of Mayan culture. The Mayans followed Venus. So it was a frightening planet because it could change on you. It could flip. And it becomes the patron planet of the alchemists in Eastern Europe. Why the ruby? Oh, that's obvious. Thank you, blood color. Whoa, that's like, that's the question the teacher gives you on the exam. It's like, so poor little Johnny will pass this test. But still get it wrong. And Johnny does, no, it couldn't be blood. What is around that jewel? What little pearls? So we have pearls twice in this portrait. And in case you're not familiar with this, do me a favor, and after I shut up, go and Google, because that's the way everybody gets their knowledge now, portraits of Queen Elizabeth I, Elizabeth Tudor, red-haired Lizzie Tudor. Her pearls. Always the pearls, right? The pearl symbolized purity, and it's a very powerful early modern symbol of, I have the phone line to God. There was no telephone, but I have the direct line to God. So when Philip II of Spain proposed to Elizabeth, and she was so cold with that proposal letter, she corrected his Spanish. Awful to do with a love letter, right? Because Philip, although he was king of Spain, was only a quarter Spanish. Half Portuguese and a quarter Flemish. He didn't write Spanish. So she, after correcting his Spanish, totally humiliating him, she sent him a portrait of herself with pearls. What is that saying? This was a religious message she was giving to him. Remember, these are the wars between Catholicism and Protestantism. I'm the one with a connection to God. Felipito. Vete a joder, I'm not gonna... Don't laugh. Why is he wearing pearls, for God's sake? Purity? What's going on here? What do you think? That is the traditional Renaissance European meaning of pearls. Think of another meaning. What could it symbolize? Why is Dracula wearing pearls?
It has to do with sex.
Most things have to do with sex, so I definitely like that.
Just a guess.
Not bad. In this case, no, but I very much like your comment.
Is it like eternal life?
That's good. Sorry?
Like eternal life? That you can't die?
Ooh, you're getting there. So, if you look at texts of late 15th century alchemy, something to do when you're born, but the 15th century is a kind of weird time. When Dracula exists, it's a weird time. It's a transition between the Middle Ages and the early modern period. It's a very weird time. The alchemists often took the meaning of something and turned it upside down. So Dracula, according to this portrait, God knows what the original Dracula would have said or done. But according to this portrait, he is a follower of the devil. So as a follower of the devil, the pearl will signify his connection to his divine or his anti-divine. And that's why you're going to see pearls on almost all the images of Dracula that were painted after his death. Interestingly enough, in the woodcuts, and there are 4 that exist of Dracula during his lifetime, no pearls. What's interesting is that he is supposed to have actually worn the pearls that stand on the top of his head. Those 5 pearls he is supposed to have worn. At least the Russian document tells us that he never walked out of Poinari Castle in Wallachia without wearing them. Why 5 pearls? Why 5? Why not 20? Why not 16? 5, 5, 5. 5, devil, 5, 5, 5, think nasty occult meanings, 5, 5,
5 elements?
Pentagram. Upside down pentagram. By the way, when you look at alchemical symbols, the upright pentagram, again contrary to what you see on the Discovery Channel, is not a symbol of evil. That's just supposed to be a symbol of knowledge. The upside down pentagram is supposed to be a symbol of evil. Whether that one is upside down or right side up, I'm going to leave to your interpretation. Because this is complicated, because again, this painter never saw Dracula. And we do not know the ideological persuasion of this painting. We only know it showed up in Poinari Castle, where Dracula had lived a century earlier. Okay? Vampires and history. So yes, there was somebody named Dracula who was born in, according to one account, according to the Russian document, he was born in 1432. There are other documents that put his put his birth at 1436. He's born in the early 1430s. He is the son of a powerful ruler, Vlad II, in Wallachia, the part of Romania, which was once part of Hungary, and which borders Transylvania. Now, those of us who grew up on a weird diet of Hollywood movies tend to think of him as Transylvanian. He was Wallachian. So let's go remake Dracula and remake the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Does anybody old enough for that? Wasn't Tim Curry cute? That was what I liked before Johnny did. So, no, he wasn't Transylvanian. He was Wallachian. And he apparently is a case, if you're going to believe the Russian document, and if you're going to believe the German documents. What do the Germans have to do with this? Hold on. The Germans are actually a bigger part of the story than either the Transylvanians or the Muslims and the other Christians. He apparently, in the forest of Brosa, after impaling, according to the accounts, 20,000 people. Now you can say, how do they know? Did they count the cadavers? I would tell you the following. While nobody may have gone into the woods and counted the cadavers of not his Muslim opponents, but the German merchants from Saxony. Those are the people he did. Stop looking at this as clash of civilizations. His main issue wasn't with the Muslims. His main issue was with the Germans. He was very jealous of them because they were successful merchants. Did anybody count the bodies? I doubt it. But use the number 20,000 to mean a horrible amount. He was a mass murderer. Now you can say, well, at that point everybody was a mass murderer. You know, no. People also had a sense of right and wrong. And despite all the barbarity of the time, the Court of the Star Chamber in England, the Inquisition in Spain, what have you, there were also people in England and Spain who criticized those things. There were also people in Romania who criticized these things. He was worse than most. Yes, he was worse than most. What he is supposed to have done in the forest of Brosa, when he was surrounded by all of the impaled bodies, was to have sat down and had a meal. And you are going to have a series of German woodcuts which depict this. And if that happened, that's possible that happened. That would be political propaganda on a very strong level, right? Whether or not he was eating human bodies is almost irrelevant. He was showing his disrespect for those he had killed. All right? So the idea of cannibalism starts to come into this. Because simply the idea of, is that really a place you would pick to have a picnic? He is horrible also for the time. So what does he have with the merchants of Saxony? So in Wallachia, there were many, many German merchants. German merchants, by the way, both Christian and Jewish. Whose you would have heard German spoken, you would have heard Yiddish spoken at that point, the very beginning of Yiddish, right? It was born in the 13th and 14th century. And they were very, very, very successful. And they were successful dealing also with the Ottoman Turks, who Vlad's father, because this is Vlad III, Dracula was Vlad III. Vlad II was not successful at dealing with the Ottoman Turks. And these German merchants were going back and forth between Romania, Christians, Jews, Muslims. They wanted to make money, and they did, and it was fine. And Vlad's father hated them, and Vlad really hates them. They are the ones he turns his brutality on. That year, 1459, is recorded in chronicles in 5 languages, so I would say this is probably true. Whether or not it's exactly 20,000, it's certainly thousands. He unleashes a terror campaign, which includes dismemberment, disembowelment, every gross, disgusting thing you can think of. He is horrible by the standards of the time. There's a reason he was considered so bad. And he unleashes that campaign against the German merchants. So if you've heard stories of Dracula impaling the Ottomans, that is historically not true. He fought the Ottomans, but he fought the Ottomans on the battlefield. His brutality was reserved for his German enemies because he thought they were going to take over Wallachia. The Forest of the Impaled, that's the origin of the Dracula legend. If you visit it, today in Romania, it's near another castle called Târgoviște. My apologies to anybody who actually speaks Romanian. I probably Hispanicized that, but there you go. By Târgoviște, as we say in Spanish, let's be authentic in Romania. Say it. That's it. That is the origin of the legend. Okay? When we look for where these stories of horror come from, because he did apparently have the custom, as political propaganda, of walking and looking at his victims impaled. And he would collect the blood in vats, and then what would he do? He would throw it at his enemies when he fought them. This is psychological terror. Okay, this is way worse than anything Hollywood can come up with. There is no ghoul on Halloween night that equals real psychological terror. He was a sickie. Okay, now the historical memory of Dracula is very, very bitter in Saxony, in Germany, because that is, well, most of the people he killed were from there. I want you to take a look at this woodcut. Please don't look too close. It's absolutely hideous, but from what you can see, okay, you see people impaled. And of course, Dracula liked that torture because it's the longest one. It lasts even longer than Roman crucifixion. You can actually survive when you're impaled for up to 3 or 4 days. This is part of his campaign of psychological terror. Right? So in other words, understand what his method was. So I'm going to impale all my German enemies. Then when the Turks, when Sultan Mehmed shows up, he's going to have to walk through the forest of Brasov and see all of these impaled cadavers. And you know what? It was enough to scare off the Sultan once. By the second time, Mehmed, who was also no darling, stopped being so revolted by it. In fact, we know he adopted the method and took it back to Constantinople. Mehmed was also not someone you wanted to invite for coffee. But basically, his hatred was for the merchants of Saxony. This is a document. You see the people being impaled, and look what you see. You see Dracula eating. Okay, remember this scene. Dracula eating meat in the forest of Brasov. And so, the dismembered bodies, let's not spend too much time on this, is absolutely hideous, but this is a political memory. Vampirism is political. We saw that in Latin America, didn't we? The vampirical Incas, the vampirical conquistadors. Anything that oppresses you is vampirical. Have you ever heard the term emotional vampire? Has anybody here ever had a friend who's not an emotional vampire? I'm not saying all our friends are emotional vampires, but I'm sure we've all had at least one in there, because he sucks you dry, right? Exploits you. This was not a clash of civilizations. This is not a Christian-Muslim apocalypse. This is Christians killing other Christians. Okay, so the way this story is presented is often very skewed. Yeah, he fought the Turks, but he gave them a lot more honor than he gave his fellow German Christians. So he is what we would call the internal tyrant. I want to recommend right now a magnificent historian of the Dracula myth and reality. If anybody's jotting it down, his name is Raymond McNally. And it's from Raymond McNally that I stole that last line, the internal tyrant. The vampire has to be somebody who's close to you. That's why we use the term an emotional vampire, right? If a friend gets to be an emotional vampire. They have to know you to bother you. Right? You don't let anybody just suck your blood, only your best friend. So this is where it comes from. Ooh, isn't that a brilliant and hideous picture? That's why I tell you, Kendra will get carted off that you didn't put your name on the introduction. Did you put it on the end? Let's, all right. The police will cart me off first. They come for yourself. It's frightening, okay, but a very interesting image, no, of terror. So, let's sum up the Dracula story historically, according to the historian Raymond McNally, who's probably the best English language source that I know. In 1462, Dracula takes the punishment he already meted out on the German merchants of Saxony and says, "Ooh, I'm going to show this to Mehmed." And he impales another 20,000. Now, who's in that group? Oh, anybody. Gypsies, Germans, Jews, your grandmother, anybody who walks by. Let's impale him. Yeah, now he was psychotic. He was psychotic. It's interesting to ask, why do people follow him? You could ask that about any tyrant, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pinochet. People are scared. I don't know. Do you follow till he comes down to you? Yeah, that often happens, right? So you have this spectacle of impalement. And that's not enough. What he does then is to cut the noses off of the cadavers. Please, I hope you all ate first. And now listen to what he does. He sends them as an incentive to join him to possible allies in the West. So we know, for example, that when Prince Enrique of Portugal got it, he vomited. Joining this lunatic. He sent, yes, decaying human noses, to all of the sovereigns of Europe, saying, "This is what I can do." And they said, there is a reason, as Raymond McNally points out, there is a reason why you would imagine that more of the sovereigns of Europe should have protected Vlad, right? Fighting the Turks, yeah, Christian cause against the Turks. Everyone was like, "Go Turks, go Turks, go Turks." He received very little help. He was frightful to the rest of Europe as well. So the 20,000 impaled were there in that place that I can't pronounce. Can you say it again? There you go. And that's where their noses were cut off and sent to all the other sovereigns of Europe. Okay, but now I have a question. And there are other historians who say, "Mr. McNally, you're believing the Turkish version. Vlad never did that." Now, if any of you go online and blog, if you blog into the Huffington Post, there was a whole bunch of vampire blogs. I don't know what they were into a year ago. They were seriously into vampires. In the Huffington Post and on Fox News, so that's interesting. Left-wing vampires and right-wing vampires. They're called our politicians. Yeah, that's what it comes down to. There was a whole bunch of vampire blogging in 2013. Where this came from, God knows, but in 2013, there were vampire bloggers. And actually, some of them were fairly interesting, because some were from reputable historical sources who said, "Whoa, wait a minute. Raymond McNally has really been looked at as one of maybe the standard source, particularly for British accounts of Dracula. But we have counter sources as well. The issue is those counter sources come from the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and those portray Dracula as a hero and say that he never cut the nose off of anyone unless he was not nice, and he impaled only a few hundred people, and of course a few hundred. You know who revived those stories was the former dictator of Romania, Ceausescu. Because Dracula was also turned into a bit of a national hero at different stages in Romania's history. Now, is it possible that some of the stories were invented by the Turks? Yes! It is! It definitely is! One of the problems with this story is that from his lifetime, we have no chronicles. Now, we certainly have a pretty disgusting aftertaste, but I would also warn you that in Europe, Latin America, and just about every place on the planet, if you don't have documents from the actual time, it becomes a little difficult to sift out reality from fantasy. This is a brutal time. And so if I stay, let me give you an example of what I mean. If I stay with Prince Enrique's reaction of, yeah, human noses, and you think, oh, so the Portuguese, my God, how civilized they were, how civilized, who was running the biggest part of the black slave trade in the New World. Those civilized Portuguese who didn't like human noses, but they certainly didn't care if half the cargo of a slave ship turned up in Brazil dead. This is an inhuman time. So vampires are as vampires do. And the spread of folklore in Vlad's lifetime really begins more roughly 10 years before he dies. So now let's talk about that. That's an amazing image. So, Kendra, when they cart you away, you will have found a great image of the forest. But this is closer to the historical reality of what he may have looked like. Now again, slightly mythologized. You see the impaling in one hand. I'm sure he impaled a few. I doubt he was a nice person. The impaling stick and the sword. Notice, if you didn't know that he was Wallachian and I lied and I said maybe he's Turkish, you would probably believe it. Because the historical costume of the time in that part of Europe, very, very heavily influenced by the Ottoman Empire. You know, and you can look, if you want to take a look at images of soldiers from what we now call Austria from that time, you're also going to see the Turkish style of dress. The Hungarian hussars all emulated it. So how does he die? Well, he's run out of his castle and flees, and 10 years later he shows up again in 1572. Now he either dies in this year or dies 4 years later, but he shows up in 1572 before his death in Bucharest. And he says now he's going to lead another charge against the Turks. But guess what? His own people do not want to fight with him, and now there are two versions of his death. One is he was assassinated by other Wallachians. I think that's probably true. Another is that he died in battle with the Turks. I'll tell you the reason that I doubt that, because he was already such a political liability. He had alienated so many people. I do not think at that point it would have been expedient to put him on the battlefield against the Turks, because most people would have fled from him. His body ends up on the island. There it says Isnagov. I've seen it spelled Snagov. Snagov without the I. Okay. So that's in Spanish, because when we write it, no word in Spanish can begin with an S. It has to have an I in front. So when Dracula was in Spain, it was Snagov. Sorry, because I think well, Kendra, when did we do this? On Thursday?
Yesterday.
By the end of the week, I stopped thinking in English because my native language is silent. That's just Snagov. And now something really nasty starts to come into this. Really ugly anti-Semitic elements, which are grafted on the story long after Dracula's death. Now, looking at the Dracula story, I can say he certainly doesn't seem to be a nice person. But I cannot, and I'd be sensitive to this because I'm a Sephardic Jew, find any element of anti-Semitism in Dracula. So give him 1 point. He was not an anti-Semite, and he was loyal to his wife. He was. The real Dracula had one wife, not six. Her name was Isola, and he apparently was a very loyal husband, so you see. Now it's 2 points. There was no element that I found that his hatred is towards his German rivals. You see, he's a disgusting person. But if I'm looking at him as an anti-Semite, no, there is no quote-unquote anti-Jewish hatred. He doesn't take any actions against the very small and very vulnerable Jewish community of the area. So why do those elements come into it? Because they enter this. They enter the folklore. Garlic, blood libels, and the sacred space of twilight. What in God's name am I talking about? I know what I'm talking about because I'm a Sephardic Jew, but you might not know what I'm talking about. Garlic. So, there is a Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jewish tradition. Sephardic meaning Spanish Jewish, Ashkenazic meaning everything else. That's racist, right? Somebody's meaning Eastern Europe, and actually German, because Ashkenaz is Hebrew for German. Okay? That's the original term for German. So, in Sephardic tradition, and this goes into Ashkenazic tradition later when the Jews are expelled from Spain, and some of them go into Eastern Europe. Garlic is supposed to protect you from evil spirits. Now, the joke in Sephardic Jewish families is that it also protects you from your friends. Because if you walk around with a chain of garlic, you're not going to be very high. Certainly, it protects you from evil spirits. One thing garlic does is to purify your blood. You know it's healthy. So people are observing these things, and garlic is considered something that protects you against spirits. The blood libel. Oh, yuck. So let's talk about it. So Jews were accused all throughout the Middle Ages of stealing Christian children and killing them and using their blood to make matzah, which is our sacred bread at Passover. Okay, folks, if you know anything about Jewish dietary law, it's not kosher. And secondly, if you want to know the difference between kosher and non-kosher meat, it's that the non-kosher meat, well, the joke in the Jewish community is non-kosher meat always tastes better because it's got more juice. Kosher meat has to be drained of the blood. I mean, the whole story is ridiculous. It was just part of what was then church-sponsored anti-Semitism. And later on, in the 17th and 18th century, these elements come into the Dracula story. But here I have to say, let me give Vlad 1 point. That was not in the original story. Other elements enter the folklore. Swooning women, subservient women, sexually really starved women, and the monogamous Dracula, because we know, right? Not two nice things about Dracula. We can leave this lesson knowing he wasn't an anti-Semite and he was loyal to his wife, right? Nice. 2 out of 3. The original Dracula had one wife who, by the way, killed herself. Suddenly, he turns up with 6. Now that's awfully interesting. That's almost grafting some Turkish elements on, right, to the Christian Eastern European element, because he would not have had 6 wives. And Bram Stoker, a great British writer of Irish background who never in his life went to Transylvania. No. But he was a magnificent writer, and he collected the Dracula legends as they were floating around London at that point, which is contemporary with one of the worst serial killers in history. Who? Jack the Ripper. So, you know, climates breed other climates. And what Bram Stoker did was to create the classic metaphor for repressed Victorian sexuality. Women couldn't admit they wanted some openly, so all you could do was lie there and fall asleep. Because a polite woman in Victorian England was not to admit that she could have an orgasm. So she had to be asleep. Well, Dracula, of course, was having a holiday. And this is a powerful sexual metaphor because you could not write an explicitly sexual novel in Victorian England or 19th century Ireland at that point under English control. So everything had to be roundabout. So Dracula flies around at night, bites the necks of women who swoon and then join his harem. This was Bram Stoker cluing into Victorian sexuality. And so the vampire legend becomes 1,000% sexualized. Okay, now this one we know was every bit as bad as we think she was, Elizabeth Bathory. And here we know this because the historical documents from her time exist. And they are actually written in the language of the country in which she was a high-born noblewoman. By the way, she was the niece of the King of Poland. In Hungary, Okay, mid-16th century Hungary. She's born, according to the documents, in 1562. She dies in 1614. She spans from the 16th to the early 17th century. In the story of Dracula, you see the ethnic tensions, yes, between the Romanians, the Hungarians, the Germans, and the Turks. This is more a story of class tension. She was an elitist, and she thought that poor people had no right to live. And she abused the local peasant population. And what she did in early modern Hungary, meaning Hungary of the 16th and 17th century, was essentially to use peasants and kill them and take their blood, because she had an obsession with human blood, believing that it would save her failing beauty. She had a skin disease, which, if I think I'm going to pronounce this right, vitiligo, in Spanish we call it vitiligo. It leads to your skin fading, the pigmentation fades. And so her beauty started to go in her early 40s, and she became quite obsessed with restoring it. And according to the story, one time when a servant girl was combing her hair, she accidentally made Elizabeth bleed, and Elizabeth saw the blood on her skin and believed that it had transformed her skin into something younger. And so she becomes a wild searcher for the fountain of eternal youth, which will be the blood of servant girls. Now, according to the Hungarian chronicles, and this is why I'm saying this story, I think, is much more historically certifiable than whatever Dracula did or did not do. She is recorded as going through the small villages of Hungary, literally with a reign of terror and kidnapping, in general young girls, sometimes young boys, taking them back to her castle, torturing them horribly, and draining their blood and then taking baths in their blood. It wasn't helping her. She was getting uglier and uglier, and the local peasants rose up and went to the King of Hungary. And this is why I will tell you I do think this story is much more historically certifiable. This is one of two cases that we have in all of early modern history worldwide, and the other one is in India, where the king actually listens to the peasants and executes a fellow noble person. So the king listens to the peasants. And the King of Hungary sends an expedition into her castle, and what they find is so hideous, and it is recorded in the chronicles. I'm not going to repeat it. She is compared in that Hungarian chronicle, which is from 1610, to Gilles de Rais, who was a notorious child murderer of the Middle Ages. Elements of sadism, sexual abuse, and murder. She's overthrown. That's it. The king arrests her, and he arrests all of her helpers, who are generally noble people, noble, very noble, from her own family. They are executed, and her he gives a special punishment to. She is starved to death slowly, and finally expires in 1614. There is an obsession in early modern Europe with finding the fountain of eternal youth. She thought she would do it through blood, and here comes one of the cruelest of the conquistadors, first governor of Puerto Rico, Ponce de Leon, Juan Ponce de Leon, and the fountain of eternal youth. Kendra put in a sign so you can see how to get to it. Juan Ponce de Leon from Extremadura in southwestern Spain, who became the first conqueror and governor of what we now call Puerto Rico, the island. Of course, his original name in Taino is Borinquen, was obsessed with finding the fountain of eternal youth. Now, he also was worried because apparently, now this disease was much more widespread than we think. He had another degenerative disease, skin disease, which we think is also vitiligo, because in the documents he records that mi color no era bueno. My color wasn't good, okay? Again, this issue of losing pigmentation. I need to find the fountain of youth. Well, he went off to what we now call Florida, what he called La Florida, where he found the very angry Seminole people who said, and fought him, and were not conquered by him. But they saw this guy's obsessed. He was obsessed. And he met a Spanish-speaking Seminole who had been captured on an earlier slave-raiding expedition by Spain. And that Spanish-speaking Seminole was no jerk, and he played with Ponce de Leon's obsession. The fountain of eternal youth is right over there in the next village. So literally he sends him on a wild goose chase. And he doesn't find it. He gets really teed off. He goes back to Puerto Rico, and he's still obsessed with finding it. He launches another expedition because another Taino Indian tells him, it's in Cuba. And he goes off to Cuba. Doesn't find it in Cuba, goes back to Florida. In Florida, he gets into another fight with the Seminole Indians, and he's wounded with a very powerful venom called curare. You don't have a lot of time left to live if you get that. He finally drops dead in 1521, or does he? A very great Puerto Rican anthropologist and writer, Olga Noya, went around the island collecting legends of El Vampiro Ponce de Leon, because the people in the country tell stories of him finding the fountain of eternal youth, and then he got screwed. Because it's not fun to live forever. Now think of this idea. We all say we never want to die. Do you really want to live for hundreds of years and outlive everyone and never be able to die? I want you to think about this idea because there's something really horrific about that idea. And in these stories, he finally begs to die. And now the Taino Indians don't let him. Hey, you wanted it, you got it. So we have a lot of legends of the undead, just like Dracula, neither alive nor dead, in the colonial New World. And that's a long time. And now that we're in the New World, let's end with the New World after he gets his. And he got his. When I say killed by the Seminole, I just want you to understand, he gets wounded by the Seminole. He actually dies when he gets back to Cuba. His body is then taken back to Puerto Rico. It's buried in the cathedral, and there are a lot of superstitions about keeping it down. And the historical fear. He found the damn fountain and became undead. Do you want to outlive everybody you've ever loved? I mean, if we say death is something horrible, there's something horrible about the idea of eternal life. Think about it. And we stay in the New World because now Dracula is going to come back. Did you know that his wife went to Peru? So we're now going to close this circle. We began with the New World, we jumped to the Old World, we come back to the New World, and of course you know by now that Peruvians have an obsession, Peruanos, with vampires also. So of course what Western legend will be very popular when it's translated into Spanish? Dracula. And Peruvians, not to be outdone by Europeans, say, the heck with it, you've got Dracula, we've got his wife. So, well, you know, Dracula's undead, so he can fly to the Americas, right? So meet Sarah Helen. Have you ever heard of this story? Okay. So we know that as the Dracula legend grows, Bram Stoker gives him 6 wives. And not in the book Dracula, although he mentions the 6 wives in the book, but in apocryphal letters written by Bram Stoker. If you ever read the collected works of Bram Stoker, he plays around with what were the fates of his wives. And with this we're going to close, because he says Sarah Helen was never found, but she keeps on reincarnating. Because she wasn't truly undead, somehow when he bit her on the neck, it wasn't 100%. Malpractice suit. So she has to die and be reborn. And so Peruvians reading this said, damn right, reborn in Peru. Actually, reborn in England, because the story is, although she's buried in Pisco in Peru, did she rise from the dead in 1993? So the story, which was completely invented in Peru, and everything is a falsification, but they did it up really well, is that she was born in England. Okay, that makes sense with the Dracula legend. She's born somewhere in England, in the moors, looking very ghostly, and she is killed by her husband, and she promises to come back in revenge while she lies dying, and then she tells her husband finally at the last minute, boy, are you going to get it, because I was one of the 6. Okay, so he tries to bury her in Blackpool. That's, of course, supposedly where this happened. They got it was in Liverpool. This would not mix with the Beatles. Black would mix with the Rolling Stones. So he tries to bury her, she pops up again. Cannot bury her. Everywhere he tries in England, she comes out of the coffin. So he says, that's it, I'm taking her to South America. Okay, now if you want to know why that sounds weird, go read English literature of the early 20th century. They're obsessed with Peru. You know Winnie the Pooh. Have you heard of Paddington Bear? The famous Paddington Bear is from Peru. Go back and read the stories. He's a little bear from Peru who's found at Paddington Station, and he tells his little girl owner all about, you know, the Incas and the stories of Peru. And there was another very famous Englishman, Clements Markham, who traveled to Peru. It was exotica, okay? For the English, it was exotica. So let's take her to Peru. And he gets to the port of Pisco and said, I'm burying you here, dear. Buries her. Says, that's it. I'm going back to England. But she comes up again, and she says, now in Spanish, because she's bilingual. Voy a volver de aquí a 80 años. I'm coming back in 80 years. So it's 1913. So 1993, the Peruvian Ministry of Tourism went to town. And I'm going to tell you that in Latin America, we're very good at using stupid Western stories. Fountain of Youth. You know, here in the Southwest, what did the native people tell Francisco de Coronado? Yeah, the golden cities of Cibola. They're over there. Okay. So Pisco had been very important in Peruvian history. It's where the liberator San Martin got off when he fought the Spanish royal troops. But it had kind of deteriorated into a nothing little port. That's it, we're going to town. So the legend of Sarah Helen suddenly appeared. And Peruvian television went to investigate the gravesite, and it was really embarrassing the first time they did it because they hadn't yet put up the artificial grave. So there's this whole story about the gravesite actually being ruined, and then suddenly the gravesite pops up. And now the question is, do you write it in English or Spanish? So it's written in English, but there were errors, which of course then Peruvian television will attribute to the fact that her husband did it really quickly, so he had to get out. And documents were found that were forged that showed her coming back in 80 years. 1993, they went to town. Everything in Pisco was Sarah Helen. Va volver, is she coming back? There were Sarah Helen hamburgers. Sarah Helen. And what they did, actually, they were very intelligent. They got it on the map again. They got the city on the map. And it drew vampire aficionados from all over the place. Because probably, unless you had heard my lecture, and I'm not going to tell you how old I was in 1993, but I hadn't yet finished my MA, so I was still quite young. You probably didn't know, if you were a Westerner, that Peru had its own vampire tradition. So vampires in Peru, cool! So you got all, you know, kids on spring break, you know, ASU type students. Wow, man, vampires! Awesome! And they raked it in, and they got Pisco on the map. And by the way, this has a happy ending for Pisco for two reasons. She didn't come up. And from 1994 onwards, Pisco started receiving the grants it wanted from the Ministry of Tourism. So the vampire legend can be turned to your advantage as well. Because vampires don't exist. You can do whatever you want.